Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas. Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jamalong, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. Hey everybody, welcome back to Bluegrass Jamalong. My guest on the podcast this week is Wayne Erbsen, and Wayne is Professor of Old-Time Music at the University of North Carolina at Asheville. He's also an author who's been writing about bluegrass and string band music for 50 years now. His latest book is called Southern Mountain Music, The Collected Writings of Wayne Erbsen, and it is a fascinating collection of articles he's been writing over a 50-year period, collecting together some amazing stuff about bluegrass people, about songs, about the culture, and I think you're really going to enjoy this. I had a great time chatting to Wayne. Check out the links in the show notes to find out the best place to go and buy the book, and for more information on Wayne's other books. But that is it. Let's crack on, and you can hear my chat with Wayne Erbsen. My guest on Bluegrass Jamalong this week is Wayne Erbsen. Wayne is Professor of Old-Time Music at the University of North Carolina at Asheville. But what we're here to talk about is his most recent book, Southern Mountain Music, The Collected Writings of Wayne Erbsen, but also 50 years of writing about this music and playing this music and teaching this music and being fascinated by this music and some of the wonderful stuff he's uncovered along the way. Wayne, it's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
It's a fascinating book. On so many levels, and it's not your only book. And I'd love to start off just by getting a sense of how you got into writing about bluegrass and bluegrass in the first place, because you've been involved in this scene for 50 years now.
Right. Well, let's see. So I started off, I'm a California guy, but I moved to North Carolina in 72 and started teaching at Central Piedmont Community College. And one reason I moved to Charlotte was because I was expecting there to be a tremendous number of old-time and bluegrass pioneer musicians there, because I know a lot of them recorded in Charlotte, like the Monroe Brothers, I think did. They were on the radio and there at the Crazy Water Barn Dance in Charlotte, and the Carter family recorded there. But when I got there, it was kind of a desert. Mm-hmm. And all those people had moved on or died, or I wasn't able to discover them. And so when I moved to, there was a program that started in North Carolina called the Visiting Artist Program. So I got accepted to that, and I moved to Hickory, North Carolina, where I found out later that the Blue Sky Boys were from. They lived a few blocks away from where I was living. And so I was walking down the street downtown Hickory one day. There was a little festival going on, and I had my fiddle under my arm. And a nice-looking gentleman who was a little older than me, by 20 years or so, said, "What you got under your arm there, boy?" And I said, "Well, it's a fiddle, sir." I introduced myself, and he was Jim Shoemate, mm-hmm. who I had understood was living in Hickory. So Jim Shoemate was a legendary fiddler who played with Bill Monroe in the 40s and was Flatt and Scruggs' first fiddler and recorded their first 4 or 5 songs on, I think it was Mercury. So I said, "Would you be willing to give me some fiddle lessons?" So he came over once a week to my house, and I took fiddle lessons. But I wasn't his best student or anything, but I realized this guy needs to be interviewed. So I wrote down his story, took notes and recorded it, I guess, on my reel-to-reel tape recorder, maybe something, a cassette tape maybe. And anyway, I recorded it, did the article, sent it into Bluegrass Limited, and voila, I was a published writer. And then, so that just kind of fell in my lap. And then years later, I had moved to Swannanoa, North Carolina. And I had already written an article on the Morris brothers, Wiley and Zeke, who wrote Salty Dog and first hired a teenager, Earl Scruggs, and also Don Reno to join their band. And so I did that article for Bluegrass Unlimited. And then after it was published, I got a letter in the mail from this guy, Cleo Davis. Well, Cleo Davis was Bill Monroe's first replacement for Charlie Monroe. And so that just fell in my lap. So I said, he lived in Lakeland, Florida. So I didn't really want to drive down to Lakeland, Florida. So I invented, to me, a new way to interview someone. I would send him a cassette tape asking him a bunch of questions, and then he would send me a tape back answering them. And so we sent 4 or 5 tapes back and forth, and then I did an article on him, and I was the first and then only person to ever interview him. And so a lot of these, so as the years went by, I ran into more and more fiddlers like Leslie Woody, who played fiddle with the Stanley Brothers on Man of Constant Sorrow and many other recordings. So I was just kind of in a nest of bluegrass pioneers, so I was able to take advantage of it. I only wish I would have taken advantage of a few more. I did do an article on Walter Davis, who had really taught a lot to the Morris brothers. So I was kind of getting close to the source of where a lot of this stuff came from. And so finally, after all these years, I finally decided to approach a publisher about publishing all these articles. And McFarland in North Carolina was very happy to do that with me. And they were very conscientious. They wanted all the I's dotted and the T's crossed, and make sure all the credits were exactly right for all the photos, which there was hundreds of photos, I guess, in there. So anyway, I'm kind of thrilled to have it out there. I've been doing a bunch of book signings, which I've thoroughly enjoyed because I found out I really like to make people laugh, and there's a lot of funny stuff in there. So in addition to the old articles that I republished, basically, I started digging around and found some little short, funny stories and stuff, which I call quickies. I wasn't sure the publisher was going to go for that, but they did. And so there's a bunch of short, little, funny, punchy, hilarious stuff on the back of the book called quickies.
And it's great because you get this sort of, there's a chunk of stuff about these pioneers that you interviewed and, you know, kind of chapters on particular songs or the fiddle or the banjo. But yeah, all that stuff at the end is things like the little bits about why people keep rattlesnakes in their instruments, or, you know, this sort of idea of Fiddler's Green as this sort of mythical place, and all that stuff's great.
Yeah, that's where I want to go.
Yeah, and I'd never heard that before. I've heard the phrase Fiddler's Green, and obviously, you know, Tim O'Brien has a record called Fiddler's Green, but I hadn't really thought about the origin of that phrase at all. And it's really interesting. But what I love is people who are interested in old time and string band music will have heard a lot of the names in the book, but there's also a lot of people kind of behind the names, and there's figures that I hadn't heard of. You know, like Leslie Riddle, for example, who used to accompany A.P. Carter on his collecting trips and kind of act as his human tape recorder. And they're fascinating characters to read about.
Yeah, he was an interesting character. And so he moved up north. I forget exactly which city, but he became friends with a young woman who was learning guitar. So he became her mentor, and I managed to get up with her, and she told me a lot of the stories and stuff about Leslie Riddle. And there's a famous photograph that is in the book that Leslie Riddle and who is the blues guitarist, Brownie McGee. And do you notice that picture in there?
Yeah.
The picture is reversed because their instruments are all upside down and backwards. So they did some shenanigans with the film in the dark room where I think they started off having the instruments upside down, left-handed like, and then they switched it again several times so that it's really kind of goofy, and it's interesting if you have to look closely at the photo because everything looks normal at first except the pick guard, which should be under the sound hole, is over the sound hole.
And so Leslie Riddle would accompany, like AP Carter would go out around the local area collecting songs essentially to add to their repertoire. And he would go with him with his guitar to sort of help learn these songs and bring them back.
Right. Well, he had a really good memory for lyrics. And he was also a wellspring of old blues songs, which he also taught to the band when they came back up to teach them the songs. And he also taught Maybelle to do like what's called Piedmont style fingers guitar, alternating bass, which I think he did on Cannonball Blues.
And it's really interesting because from this point of time, looking back on like decades and decades of bluegrass and pre-bluegrass history, it's easy to focus on the figures like the Carter family or Jimmy Rogers and forget that they were part of a whole musical world in that bit of America that, some names have kind of been remembered and some haven't.
Right. Well, I'm all about remembering the little guy if I can. So I had an idea the other day. I hope I follow up on it, which is so I'm a Facebook guy, and I was thinking of putting a thing on there to challenge people to submit Carter family style songs that they had written. And so I have written one that I think is pretty Carter family esque, and so I'm going to try to do that and see what people come up with. Encourage people to write songs like the AP did.
Yeah, and so many of those songs are kind of based on things that were around in some form already and was, collected. And because I guess that early recording scene was pretty hungry for new material. We'll be right back with you just after this. The long-awaited Hill Country series from Collins Guitars represents a new voice in their acoustic lineup. Rooted deep in the bluegrass world, these new Dreadnought and OM models feature a strong fundamental tone with a dry, warm and woody character that's sure to catch the attention of players who hold the vintage instruments of the 30s in their highest regard. Watch world-class pickers Jake Workman, Kenny Smith and Bob Minner perform with new Hill Country instruments on the Collins Guitars YouTube channel, and learn more at collinsguitars.com.
Yeah, but Ralph Peer, who was their producer and manager and recording executive, he made a deal with Victor Records where he would go out and record these people, and his only wages would be, I think, $1 a year if he could have the publishing rights. Well, that was not very well understood back then. But the publishing rights was a treasure trove because he would get royalties for those songs for the next 70 plus years. So the only stipulation when he hired a group to record, they had to have songs that were already in the public domain or songs that they had rearranged drastically or songs that they had composed. Well, the Carter family fit perfectly into that. So that's where the money came in, and he became very wealthy.
And when you sort of first started writing about people like Cleo Davis, and were they? You said you were the only person who ever interviewed him. Were the people you were approaching kind of surprised to be interviewed? It sounds like people hadn't been interviewing them much. People weren't that interested in the roots of bluegrass.
Well, I think they were delighted. I know Cleo Davis was a very affable person, and he enjoyed telling a story, and he was a very good storyteller. And like some of the people, like the Morris brothers, Wiley and Zeke, those guys were nonstop talkers. Like you couldn't get them to shut up. So they just wanted to go on and on. Yeah. So yeah, they were all really happy to tell their story.
Yeah, and I guess around the time you were talking about, Deliverance probably really lit a fire under people being interested in that sort of music.
Well, it really did, and it's kind of an awful movie in a lot of respects. But the movie Deliverance played a big part in my career because I had just rambled down to Charlotte and got hired to teach at Central Community College, and they said, "What do you want to teach?" And I said, "Well, I want to teach banjo, fiddle, guitar, mandolin, dulcimer, string band, repertoire, history of country music, and by the way, I have a master's in American history." So, so I started teaching that fall, and right then Deliverance came out. Well, everybody and their brother suddenly wanted to learn the banjo, so I had huge classes, people waiting around the block practically to take my classes. And so out of that came my first book, which I randomly called A Manual on How to Play the Five-String Banjo for the Complete Ignoramus. And that book now is about 60 years old or so, and it's still going strong. And so that's how I got into the publishing business, because I printed it myself,
And lots more books followed. Not all about music, some about the culture of kind of the, North Carolina and folk culture, history.
Right. Yeah, I did one called The Rural Roots of Bluegrass, which is a really good history of the music plus songbook. I did one called The Outhouse Papers, which is kind of like a bathroom reader for country people. I did one called Manners and Morals of Victorian America, and I had a lot of fun with that. So I did do some books that weren't related to music directly.
And it is really interesting. It's one of the things that you dig in this book, but also the previous one, is that that sense of where these songs came from, because it's easy just to sort of presume they're all, folk songs, or they're all, but just things like Salty Dog Blues, for example, you talk about in this book, and I think a lot of people just presume these songs just sort of arrived somewhere, and the stories behind them are often fascinating.
Well, I find that fascinating too, because I have a degree or two in American history, so I've always loved words, I always loved songs, and I always loved the history of it. And it's interesting that when I would go to a jam session, people didn't really like my singing that much, but they liked the fact that I was the only one in the jam session who knew the words to so many songs. And at one time, I knew almost 1,000 songs, the lyrics, all the verses and the chorus. So I was welcomed at most jam sessions, and eventually I figured out how to sing a little bit. So most of my books, my music books, have the backgrounds of where the songs came from, who wrote them, why they write it, how did it get published, or different interesting aspects about the songs themselves. So I enjoyed that a lot.
And at that point in the 70s, was there like a sense of, because it sounds like from the early days you had a strong sense that you were documenting something, not just writing articles. You were sort of documenting a history before it went.
Well, I figured that was an important part of it, because most of these guys were elderly when I recorded them, although Jim Shoemate was only 55 when I first interviewed him, so he was kind of at the peak of his playing career. But I actually recorded him in my living room with several other guys. I found this guy, Albert Maples, who sang and played guitar exactly like Lester Flatt. I played mandolin and had headphones on, and was running the control board while also playing mandolin. And Mark Pruitt, I got to play banjo. And I sent it to Dave Friedman over at County Sales. And for some reason, he turned it down, although I was surprised. But just the fact that I had that demo, this company up near Galax, Virginia, I'll think of his name in a minute, took that on and recorded several other albums of Jim Shoemate. And then recently, a couple of years ago, there's a group called the Field Recording Collective. And they're a group of some friends of mine who have made a record label out of old recordings that people have done, home recordings. So there's my original Jim Shoemate album is available there.
It's really interesting with some of the old recordings. Just reading the book and the chapter on Eck Robertson, who's a name that I knew and I'd heard bits before, and I went back and listened, and just the energy in that playing and the kind of, it's, apart from recording techniques, it sounds so vibrant and so immediate. And I think it's one of the fascinating things about those old recordings is when you hear one of them amongst a bunch of new stuff, it sounds really old and really scratchy. But when you listen to several of them back to back, you stop even hearing that really. And you're just hearing people play music.
Right. Well, let's see, Eck, one of the first songs he recorded was Sally Gooden, and no one's ever played it as good. And everybody tries, but a lot of the old timers would tell me about what it was like to record usually they would record in a hotel room, and they would have they would put blankets on the walls where they were recording, and then they would have the room next to it where the engineers would, and they would have, this is how it was described to me many times, they would have cakes of wax, and the turnstylist would actually cut grooves in the wax as it went around, and that's how they preserved it. And then it was summer a lot of times when they came down, so they would pack those wax discs on ice and send them up to New York to get them made into plates.
Yeah, and you think about how fragile all that equipment was and all that, but it's amazing we've still got some of that, really, isn't it?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And like with all those figures that you talk about, there's chapters and all sorts of people from the early days of Blue. Are there any particular favourites of yours in terms of people that you think have been a little bit forgotten that people should know more about?
Well, one of the people that I love to tell their story, I'll tell it really quick, is Charlie Cline, who was Curly Ray Cline's brother. Now, Curly Ray Cline is better known because he played with Ralph Stanley and the Lonesome Pine Fiddlers. Well, his brother Charlie actually played all the instruments with Bill Monroe, including mandolin, when Monroe was injured in a traffic accident, I believe. And so somebody quoted Bill Monroe later saying, "I never did like Charlie's banjo playing." But he didn't tell him that because he recorded on pretty much all the instruments. So Charlie was a powerful musician, but it turned out he was also a powerful snorer. And one time, Bill Monroe at his festival, Bean Blossom, had these little funky shacks where the Bluegrass Boys would have to stay in little bunks and stuff. Well, it was wintertime and it was snow on the ground. It was snowing, and they went in there and threw a log on the fire, and they all went to sleep. Well, pretty soon Charlie started snoring really loud, and everybody woke up except Charlie, and they decided they'd play a trick on him. So they carefully and quietly carried his cot outside, laid it down carefully in the snow falling rapidly, went inside, threw another log on the fire, and went back to sleep. Well, when Charlie woke up, he was covered with a foot of snow, and he realized what had happened. So he found some old rags, and he climbed up on the roof, and he stuffed rags down the chimney. And as soon as the door flew open and the the Bluegrass Boys were smoked out and they ran out coughing and stuff, that he ran downstairs, locked the door, put another log on the fire, and that's where the Bluegrass Boys spent the night.
Brilliant. And one of the chapters I really enjoyed is a figure that people will know much more about, I'm sure, is Clarence White. And I've heard you say, and I can't remember if it was in the book or if it's something else that I'd read, that you, because you grew up in California, went to the Ash Grove to see music.
Every week. Oh, gosh. Well, it's interesting. About a week ago, a friend of mine's son is writing a book on Clarence, and he interviewed me. And actually tonight, someone else is going to interview me about Clarence White. For some reason, there's a lot of interest right now. So I lived near the Ash Grove when I was about 16 to about 18. And the folk music revival had just started up big. And the house band on Monday nights was the Kentucky Colonels with Roland and Clarence White, Billy Latham, Roger Bush on bass, and Leroy Mack on dobro. Well, I didn't realize what I had, although I loved the music, but I figured everybody played guitar like Clarence. Who knew? So, but he was very, very shy, so I never did really get to talk to him much. But he did borrow my little Martin guitar to play on stage a few songs. I think he played the Wildwood Flower. He tuned it. And, I never wanted to tune it after that. In fact, many years later, when I sold it, I advertised the fact that it had been played by Clarence White. And I'm sure that added a few $1,000s to the price I eventually got.
And you must have seen a whole host of other people come through that club then if you went every week at that time.
Oh, Lord of mercy. It was like getting a PhD twice, going there every week. I'll try to list off some of the people that I saw. I saw Booker White. I saw Son House. I saw Reverend Gary Davis, Maybelle Carter, Merle Travis, Platt Scruggs, Bill Monroe. I'm sure I'm forgetting Roscoe Holcomb, Maybelle Carter, and all the other ones that, Rosalie and Joe Maphis. And Joe Maphis was a big influence on Clarence White, and Joe Maphis was a powerful musician. I went to the UCLA Folk Festival. I forgot to mention Doc Watson. Well, at the Folk Festival, I went to the guitar workshop with Joe Maphis, Doc Watson, and Clarence White. And Clarence was sitting between them. And somebody asked Clarence where he learned, and he said, from these guys right here, plus some Django Reinhardt. And then somebody asked Joe Maphis what kind of pick he liked to use. And it was funny. He held up his pick like he'd never looked at it before. He said, gee, I don't know. Rosalie just hands me a pick when we go up on stage, which is so funny because people spend hundreds of dollars on picks.
Yeah, people are really obsessed about that stuff. And it just goes to show. And it is like this span of time we're talking about that you've been writing over, so much must have changed in the world of bluegrass, along these lines. Some of those names that have stood the test of time and some have been forgotten, but the landscape must be entirely different now, because going about finding that information in the early 70s, because everything's available at the tap of a button now if you know where to look. But to start documenting things like that, and it's fascinating hearing you say you sent tapes back and forward and you just found ways to do it. What are the biggest sort of shifts you think you've seen along that arc of bluegrass?
Well, pretty much I've only followed traditional hardcore bluegrass like the Stanley Brothers and groups like Flat Scruggs and the Monroe Brothers, and I play all the instruments, and so I'm not really up too much. I do like Molly Tuttle. Just found out her band have gone elsewhere, and she's got a whole new band.
Yeah.
So I look forward. I would go to see her, but really, I don't really follow the younger bands, if it has more than 3 chords, I'm really not that interested in it. When I was in London in the early 70s, I was trying to. My partner and I thought we had something special, but we found out there was tons of traditional music in England. I think there was an Irish bluegrass band that was pretty good, but I can't remember what they were called. But there wasn't many bluegrass bands in England back in the early 70s.
Well, it's so funny you mentioned this in the book that, the idea of so much music came over to North Carolina from England and Ireland and Scotland, and to the extent that Cecil Sharp came over there in the early 20th century to try and find some of it because it had all but died out here. And, the journey that British folk music has gone on and the journey that American folk music has gone on, and they're so intertwined, and yet they're also really different things.
Yeah, so I actually interviewed or talked to a gentleman who was a boy when Cecil Sharp was recording songs from his parents. And also near Asheville, where I live, in Hot Springs, there was a ballad singer, I can't think of her name right this second, who was the one he collected the most songs from. And right now it's a bed and breakfast. Well, my wife and I stayed there many years ago, and this woman who knew all the songs loved children. Well, my wife we were upstairs in a bedroom, and she walked by this other bedroom. The door was open. She saw a woman looking down fondly at a baby, apparently in a crib. She was dressed all in white, and realized pretty soon that was a ghost. So it was the ghost of that person. And a friend of mine had written a book about her. And when I said that to her, she said, well, she had never seen that ghost, but she'd talked to other people who had. So my wife actually saw the ghost of the ballad singer.
And that's one of the interesting things that, like reading the book, that I think I must have known this in some form, but it hadn't really occurred to me as clearly as this, that you said that the women were often the carriers of the ballad singing tradition. Like so much of the vocal music that got passed down was passed down by women, through women. So much of the music that Cecil Sharp collected was from women, and the men may have played the instrumental stuff, but the vocal songs were largely passed down through women.
There was a few men, but generally that's right. The women did the ballads, and the reason for that is, well, it wasn't considered ladylike to play an instrument, because a lot of the music took place at dances out in the country in barns and stuff, where there was a lot of liquor being passed around. And a lot of times the dance would end up with bullets flying every which way. So there was some good reasons why you wanted to protect your lovely daughter from getting a bullet hole in her at a dance. So the men tended to do the rockier, anyway, the men would do the raunchier kind of string band music, and the women more or less stuck to the ballads.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And is most of the work you've done sort of focused around North Carolina? Because it feels there's a very regional kind of slant to a lot of the writing you've done.
Well, that's interesting. Well, that's kind of where I lived. So I kind of got what was the low-hanging fruit. But I have a log cabin in Southwest Virginia, but I can't recall interviewing anybody up there too much. I was friends with Albert Hash, the legendary fiddle maker and fiddler, but I don't believe I ever did a story on him. I should have, because he was pretty interesting. I got invited to his wedding, to his funeral, and but it was so crowded. He was so well loved that I couldn't even get in the door. We had to stand out in the yard.
And I think,
I invited him to our wedding, is what I meant to say.
I think, one of the great things about a regional focus is that you get to really dig deep and find those people that are the people behind the stories. And, think sometimes if you try and do a too big a geographical area, you miss all those wonderful little stories as well.
Right. Well, one of the things I hope to convey in the book, since I knew these people personally really well, and so I was trying to let people know the human side of them, not just the recording data and this and that. I wanted them to know the personal side of them, so I tried to bring out their humanity as well as their humor. And there's a lot of really funny stories in the book, so I'm delighted to be able to pass those on.
Yeah, and I think the book does a really good job of that, of bringing some of those characters to life and telling their stories. And rather than, like you say, rather than just lists of dates and names and record labels, to hear what the people were like is fascinating. It's a really interesting book, and I've really enjoyed talking to you about it. It's been a treat. Thank you.
Oh, gosh, yeah. Thanks for having me.
Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas.